We're in a really exciting moment for forests with a lot of opportunity right now. So President Biden is the first president to ever issue an executive order about protecting mature and old growth forests. This is the first time in decades that the Forest Service has considered making a national policy that could protect forests from logging. But as you'll hear from our panel, their draft proposal is full of loopholes that would still allow logging and selling of old growth trees. And then this is nearly the last showing of this film. We've been on the road since June. We've done, and we being the larger forest protection community, probably 50 some in-person screenings, including two in Washington, D.C. last week, one for the public and one for decision makers and their staff. And we'll talk about this again, but comments are due at 11:59 Eastern on Friday. We've already generated more than 250,000 comments asking for strong forest protections. And we really hope that all of you will submit one, at least yourself, and get other folks involved too. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex Craven with Sierra Club to introduce himself and our panel.
Thanks, Lynn. My name is Alex Craven. I'm based here in the Northeast. I'm the Forest Campaign Manager for Sierra Club and have had the privilege of working with all the folks on this screen right now, and probably many of you here in the audience as well. I have to just say a quick thank you for bearing with us through some of the technical hurdles, including the clear-cut patch from our Zoom screens that prevented us from watching the full screen there for a little bit. But it is my distinct pleasure now to introduce to you folks who represent a geographic breadth of experience, as well as a wealth of information, both on the film and the filmmaking process, as well as the inner workings of the Forest Service. So with no further ado, I'll start with the top left of my screen. Alex Harris, who you might recognize, based in Colorado, impact creator, engaging online viewers to care about nature and take action to protect it. He's got over 800,000 followers and 100 million views across social media platforms. Jim Furnish is based in Gila, New Mexico, former deputy chief of the U.S. Forest Service. He's on the board of directors of Wild Earth Guardians and author of Toward a Natural Forest. Zach Porter is co-founder and executive director of Standing Trees, working to protect public lands across New England. And Adam Rizian is the rewilding manager with Wild Earth Guardians, working to protect mature and old growth forests throughout the Northern Rockies, as well as priority areas in New Mexico and Arizona. So going to start off with a question coming your way, Alex Harris. As you indicated in the film, you spent a full year traveling the country, talking with people about forests. Clearly, there are many reasons that people want to see forests kept intact and protected. To you, what were some of the themes that you want to make sure the policymakers take away from this film?
Yeah, good question. And thanks also to everybody for taking time tonight to watch the film that team and I made. I really, really appreciate it and appreciate all the work that everyone here is doing to protect these places. I think the main themes that we saw across the country is first and foremost passionate bipartisan support. So as you saw, we traveled to a red state, a swing state, and a blue state. And on the first day in each of those states, we had a community meeting of sorts with people in the area that anyone could join. You saw that in West Virginia in the film. We didn't show it for the other states, but obviously, since we as a film team are in the realm of environmental protection, there was a little bit of bias toward that, but we wanted to make sure that we could talk to anyone and chase resonant stories in the area. So we left a lot of open time in our schedule before going to these places to just meet with folks that we met improvisationally. Tish and Eric, for example, in Oregon, just showed up to the brewery that we were meeting at people with on day one in Oregon and started talking to Aiden and explained the wildfire that had happened to them in their house. And he noted that it would probably be really good to spend time with them. So we did, and now are very good friends because they had such a compelling story. So we know through personal experience, but also through polling and research, that everyone across the country generally cares about taking care of the world that we call home. So affirming that within ourselves and then aligning with it is positive for anyone that wants the most public support possible. The second point that I would bring up is that this won't impact timber supply very much, since less than 5% of US lumber comes from federal land, and mature and old growth make an even smaller percentage of that. So of course we need wood, obviously we need wood, but we can protect these trees and still harvest wood to use from other land designations. Protecting these places presents a much more lucrative economic opportunity for decision makers' constituents. The Forest Service, as we saw in the film, reports that $10 billion is spent annually by people recreating in these places. Specifically, that money is spent in communities near national forests, and in their reports, it says that it comes from people over 50 miles away. So they understand and publish that recreation brings in cash for Americans, and the number of jobs in that sector is much higher. Definitely try to stress that. And then finally, and very importantly, meaningful Indigenous involvement is a requirement to doing this right, full stop. Indigenous leaders' knowledge reaches farther back in time, and their cultural ethic comes from the land that we're talking about instead of a different continent entirely. And reparations are beyond owed by our country. So I think not only in the federal decision-making realm, but also in our own organizational realms, leadership and resources and decision-making power should be handed to them.
Great, thanks, Alex. So my first question is for Jim, and I think one of the things that I've learned doing this organizing, and I think both Alexes have also learned this, that many people are unaware that there are no formal protections for old growth across the national forest system. A lot of people think that was solved in the 80s. And we've received a few questions about this in the chat. So Jim, what went through your mind when you heard President Biden direct land managers to identify, inventory, and protect both mature and old growth forests on federal land? Why is this so important? And has the Forest Service done anything like this before?
I remember that day well. Earth Day, 2022, 2.5 years ago. And this was long overdue. Sadly, the Forest Service has mostly been noted for its elimination of old growth forests rather than its protection. And I think what we've learned since the heyday of logging on the national forests is the importance of ecological services that mature and old growth forests provide, the challenge of climate change, and the robust resource that mature and old growth forests are in dealing with global carbon. All of these are reasons why I celebrated that announcement and why it was so long overdue. I've been waiting for ever since I retired, and some of our early nascent efforts to protect old growth never really took footing. But so here we are. We've got an executive order that directs the Forest Service to protect and conserve mature and old growth forests, and we're at the doorstep now to see what happens.
Thanks, Jim. So, Zach, you live in the Northeast, which is actually where I'm from. I live in Denver now, but originally from New Jersey. And I'm hoping you can paint a picture of what Eastern and Northeast forests look like. So tell us about how those are different from those in the West and why. What's the history there?
Yeah, thank you, Len, and thanks again to Alex for this amazing film, and to the whole panel for inviting me to participate, join you today. The forests of the East are carbon storage powerhouses, and I would say vastly underappreciated for that role that they can play in mitigating global climate change. They're also incredibly important for, of course, biodiversity, for dealing with the major flooding issues that are hitting the Eastern US hard right now, as they have recently in my home state of Vermont and the capital of Vermont, Montpelier, where I live. These forests have value, just simply intrinsic value, and we haven't honored that enough as a society either. One of the issues that may be a little more unique to the Eastern US, but is honestly something that is the case nationwide, is that the forests of the East have gone through just absolutely amazing transformation over the last 150 years, from near total devastation, We lost most of our forest cover in the eastern U.S., especially here in the Northeast, during colonial settlement and agriculture. And then following agricultural abandonment in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we've had this incredible forest recovery. But that recovery is only in its infancy. And I think for most Americans, we look out the window in the eastern US, you fly overhead and you see green down below. But that curtain of green is only telling you a portion of the story. And what we've missed is what's beneath the veneer. We really need to better understand what's going on at the ground level. And unfortunately today, our forests are being managed in a way that really stunts the recovery of these amazing eastern forests. Today, we store more carbon in our forests across the east than is stored in western forests. We can store many times more carbon in eastern forests simply by letting more of them grow old. And just to give you an example of the degree of transformation that has gone on here, today, where I live in the Northeast, just 0.1% of our forest has never been cut since European settlement. In the Green and the White Mountain National Forest, where I work, less than 0.5% of each forest is old growth today. So just protecting the old growth we have should be easy. There should be no debate about protecting the scant remnants that exist today. We should be having a conversation about how we're going to recover old growth across a significant portion of our landscape. And that's what public forests give us the opportunity to do. So anyways, thrilled to be talking about this with you all, and looking forward to talking more about how we can make this policy even better that the Forest Service is working on right now.
Thanks, Zach. And thanks for folks using the emoji support buttons for our panelists. Keep those coming. This next one is for Adam. Adam, you live in the Northern Rockies. Can you tell us about the forests in your part of the country and say a little bit about why they're important and the threats that those forests face?
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate being here and joining such a stellar lineup of folks. It's great to see everybody and be part of the process. Forests in the Northern Rockies, they span northern Idaho, western and central Montana, and parts of Wyoming. So that's what we think about when we hear Northern Rockies. And they include truly unique ecosystems with a range of trees, including Pacific yew and hemlock to larch and high elevation lodgepole pine and threatened whitebark pine. They also include mixed conifer species like Douglas fir and big old ponderosa pines, my favorite. They smell like vanilla or butterscotch when they warm up in the sun. These forests are super important. They support a range of fish and wildlife species, including Chinook salmon in eastern Idaho to bull trout in western Montana. Canada lynx and wolverine depend on the mature and old growth forests, and as do fisher and pine marten. Grizzly bears also depend on these intact forests for their recovery. So we have just a stellar lineup of wildlife species that we get to enjoy up here in the Northern Rockies. And, these forests are also super important for their ability to store vast amounts of carbon and serve as part of a broader natural climate crisis solution, particularly the wetter forests that we see in eastern Idaho and northwest Montana, especially a very special place called the Yak Valley, where we had seen the Forest Service propose a big timber sale called the Black Ram that we're working with our partners to help try and stop. So the biggest threats there here are not from wildfire that you often hear about from the Forest Service and see on your TV. Actually, the biggest threat, or one of the biggest threats that we see out here, is the aggressive logging and road building that the Forest Service conducts under the guise of reducing wildfire risks. And coupled with livestock grazing and poorly managed recreation, particularly motorized recreation, those are the threats that we're seeing out here in the Northern Rockies. Thank you.
So Adam, maybe just to hammer that home, the language that we hear about inappropriate vegetative management and cutting, those aren't viewed as threats out your way in the Northern Rockies?
Well, certainly the timber industry and the Forest Service and their proponents like to use wildfire as the biggest threat, and they propose what I often call chainsaw medicine to kind of, address those threats. But in reality, it is actually the aggressive logging and thinning and too frequent burning that we see as the biggest threat out here.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. And circling back to another question that we got in the chat, this one was reaffirming the need for supporting tribes and indigenous management, and then asking for some clarity about the Menominee management section. So I think I'm going to pitch it to both Alex and Jim here. Alex, would you mind elaborating on what you saw about how Menominee manage their lands? And then Jim, could you speak a little bit to how that differs from federal land managers? So Alex, we'll start with you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm reading the question from Lisa and really appreciate that. Just so everyone knows what the question is, it's I don't quite understand the Menominee philosophy when I see 150-year-old trees cut for lumber. Can we elaborate a little on this? I agree that indigenous knowledge is extremely valuable. It was a great question, and one that we definitely had as a film team going into it. Like I shared in the film, it was cognitively dissonant for me to see that happening. I think a really important thing to understand is that they have been practicing a different style of management for centuries. As you saw, their land was reduced to a very small fraction of their original sovereignty, and they have had to make do with that. I'm obviously not the best messenger for this. They are the best messenger for this, and I urge you to reach out to them. They have contact information available on their website, both for the Menominee Nation and also Menominee Tribal Enterprises, which is the company that they do the forest management through. So please, if you really want to learn more about this, talk to them and reach out to them about it. But since they had to adapt to a changing world that was forced upon them, they decided to do so by managing their timber in the most sustainable way that they could, and that meant letting trees live much longer. It meant letting trees live longer as a result of continuing to take the least healthy trees on their land, so that over time the quality of the trees continued to go up and up and up and up when looking at them for lumber, and also obviously held a land ethic that valued ecosystem restoration and living with the land. So they do cut down old trees, but you have to remember that in that specific parcel of the world, there are many more old trees compared to the rest of the US. They are cutting down old trees, but literally all of their trees are old. So they take fewer and smaller numbers of them every time they do a cut. So they'll take, like, say, a couple very old trees that are the least healthy of their old trees every 15 to 20 years, and then process those. If they're doing anything resembling a clear cut, it's with a species that it makes sense to do it with, that usually regenerates that way anyway, like aspen, and they don't just like blast that out across every single tree species. So they're very sensitive to the ecological diversity of their land, try to bolster it, try to encourage it, and also have leaned into the fact that they have had to adapt to a more industrialized society involuntarily. So that's my initial response to it, and I would strongly urge you to reach out to them if you're interested in that and want to learn more about it. Oh, and actually, sorry, one more thing that I would say is that even though the language that they use is very similar to the language that federal forest management circles tend to use, it's very obvious when you're there in person that the practices themselves are carried out in a different and more thoughtful way. So that's another thing that I would lean into when thinking about how to understand that. And I'll pass it to Jim, because I'm really curious about your perspective on this too.
Okay, thank you. I first heard of the Menominee reservation model back in the mid-90s when I was a forest supervisor on the Oregon coast. And I actually wrote about the Menominee model. I have a great deal of respect for it in my book, Toward a Natural Forest. So what I'm going to try and do very quickly is contrast what I see as a national forest management model with the Menominee model. The Menominees inherited a forested landscape with their reservation. And if you go to the Google Earth and look around, you'll see that much of the surrounding lands have been converted to agriculture. But they have maintained a mature old growth forest character on their reservation from the very beginning. The Forest Service, most of the national forests were characterized by mature and old growth forests at their inception in the early 1900s. They remained much so until after World War II, when the Forest Service really became a logging agency, and old growth was viewed as pretty much worthless except to convert to younger, healthy, economically efficient forests. And so the Forest Service set about for decades to eliminate, through clear cutting largely, most of the old growth forests that they encountered. Now we have national forests, which tend to be depauperate or lacking in old growth character, and they're trying to do something to maybe protect and hopefully even restore some. The Menominees already have it. Virtually their entire reservation is mature and old growth in character, and so they are very systematically sustaining it through selective harvesting. The Forest Service has got a big hill to climb to bring back, and this is one of the fears of this NOGA that they're working on currently, is it's a very minimalistic effort to basically try and hold on to what they have, but in terms of restoring a lot of the mature and old growth character to our national forest landscapes, it's woefully lacking.
Thanks.
May I-
I'm gonna,
Back on that one real quick, Len and Alex.
yes, quickly.
I think another really important bit of context for our audience tonight is that the Menominee, aren't hiding the fact that there is an economic component. There's a commercial motivation in part to what they are doing on their reservation, and a critical distinction between the way that we manage private lands and public lands, in my mind, should be what we are prioritizing in land management. And it is completely up to the Menominee how they would like to manage that landscape. That's entirely, their sovereign land, their call to make. But on public lands that we all own in common, that should be serving the public good first and foremost, we need a different set of values and priorities to rule the day. And unfortunately, we've been managing public lands largely for commercial outputs, for extracting wood products as the primary purpose. And what we have the chance to do with this National Old Growth Amendment is to try to reprioritize what the purpose of these public lands are. And as Alex has made clear, Jim has made clear, these lands are not a major source of wood products nationally, but the amount of logging that's going on these public lands is, again, stunting our forests and preventing the recovery of old growth. So to me, it's a clear choice to make in terms of how we shift management in public forests. And I think that's a really key distinction between what we saw on the Menominee segment and how that can be an example for private land forestry, for example, compared to the opportunity that we have with public forests, like the national forest featured in the film.
Thanks, Zach. So there are a couple questions about alternatives to old growth. And I'll say that's probably a whole separate webinar, and I could talk for an hour about alternatives to wood, but a couple things to flag here. So keep in mind, first of all, that less than 5% of the timber cut in the US is actually logged on federal land. So we can actually protect these older trees on our public land without having to solve the what do we do instead of wood. But we should solve that problem in the long run. And we can sub in for both wood and pulp a number of different things. So wood, actually, the biggest thing is reclaimed wood. There's an insane amount of wood in American landfills. because we bulldoze houses and we throw it all into the landfill instead of taking it apart and reusing the wood. So that's thing number one, literally just being more mindful about how we take apart buildings. On the pulp front actually on the furniture and non-supporting beams front, there's bamboo, as long as it's being grown sustainably. There's hemp, there's wheat straw, there's a ton of different, options, and we're in a challenge where we need to both increase supply so that more people can have access to it, and we need to increase demand so that there's more supply. But organizations like Environment America, Sierra Club, other groups are working on that, sort of under as a separate campaign, working to encourage American companies to use better products. So that's kind of the long-term answer, but the short-term answer is they could stop cutting all of the old growth in our forests tomorrow, and I don't think it would actually have a significant impact on the industry. So that's answers a couple questions all in one. Alex Craven, did you want to punt the Southeast question or punt that straight to Alex Harris?
Yeah, let's send that to you, Alex. I think it relates to what Len was just talking about, but we got a question in the chat that asked if folks have looked at the forests to the southeast that are falling prey to the biomass wood pellet industry. Zach, you want to take that one?
I'd be happy to, but Alex is welcome to go first. I didn't have any intention of interrupting.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer and pass it to you, Zach. Thanks. We sort of looked at it. There a lot of people talked about it. They like Frank said in the film, they followed a timber truck that was harvesting some of the mature and old growth around his area, and it went straight to a charcoal plant. But in all honesty, I think Zach probably is the better person to answer this one. So feel free to go for it.
Well, I think what a lot of people probably don't know, although we have a pretty knowledgeable audience, I'm guessing tonight, is that the Southeast is the wood basket of America. We get more wood from the Southeast US than any other corner of the country. And the majority of that, again, comes from private land, which makes national forests that much more important as places where we should be emphasizing other values. And the same can be said for much of the eastern U.S., where there's a significant private land timber industry. National forests make up a relatively small percentage of the landscape compared to, say, the western U.S., and play an outsized role in protecting important habitat for all of the imperiled species that rely on old forests that are in dire need of habitat today. And of course, like we've talked about, all the carbon, the clean water, the flood mitigation values, et cetera. So knowing that our private lands are being hammered across the eastern US for wood products, our public lands are that much more important, makes the National Old Growth Amendment that much more critical to the future of these eastern forests. So yeah, biomass is obviously a huge influence on forest management across the Southeast US, and that is expanding as we see more and more incentives from state and federal governments for bioenergy, biomass, electricity, wood, heat, et cetera, across the nation right now. And it's really sad to see those incentives put in place when we should be moving towards truly low carbon energy. So it's a real threat to our forests.
All right, so I think Alex and I will ask a couple other questions of the panelists and try to work in some more audience questions, and then we'll see which other ones we can get to. But so Jim, you've already told us that you spent your career working for the Forest Service, and we've heard you talk about why older forests are so important. There have been a couple questions, and so I was hoping that you put you on the spot as the former bureaucrat, if you could explain the difference between an executive order and a forest plan amendment, and also talk about the feasibility of a nationwide amendment. So what's required of the Forest Service, of the agency, to fulfill President Biden's commitment and actually meaningfully protect our oldest forests?
Yeah, so the President Biden's executive order really set in motion a series of actions that were incumbent on the Forest Service and the BLM, to name another, to actually put wheels in motion to make real his commitment to mature and old growth forests. And with all the different national forests across the United States, there are about 125. The plan amendment then would enable and authorize these national forests to actually act on that executive order. It's very doable. When I was the deputy chief, we developed the roadless conservation rule, which affected 2% of all the lands in the United States. The Forest Service is, give or take, 200 million acres, about 35 million acres of wilderness designated by Congress, and about 60 million acres of other undeveloped roadless lands. So in combination, the wilderness lands and the roadless lands constitute about half of our national forest lands. The Forest Service had a real problem. The Forest Service itself was the greatest threat to roadless land values, largely through logging and road building. So we had a national problem with roadless consequences. We needed a national solution. And so we developed a national rule to suspend commercial logging and new road construction in roadless areas. Very straightforward, very simple. Now, 20 years later, we find ourselves with a national problem, what to do about old growth that needs a national solution. And this effort is what the Forest Service is undertaking to try to comply. What concerns me, this is such a great opportunity for the Forest Service really to create a new arc for management of the national forests. And we've seen, as I said earlier, just a very minimalist response to the executive order, one aspect of which leaves out mature forests entirely.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm done.
If you want to keep talking. And then let's see. And then there was a question, I think I might just well, I'll say something to this and then Zach, I'm gonna loop it into yours, but there's a question, how do you go about plugging the loopholes mentioned? So at the beginning, I mentioned there's a bunch of loopholes. Is there an effort made to add or to basically make the amendment have complete protection? We are the effort. So the way that they plug the loopholes is that what they've put out right now is a draft. They're going to put out a final and the 250,000 people that we've already gotten involved and you and anybody that you tell about this is basically demanding that those loopholes get plugged. So that's how we plug the loopholes. And then Zach, in your opinion, does the draft policy proposal, so this is the draft of the old growth amendment, which is the thing we're reacting to and commenting on, will that help increase the abundance and distribution of old growth in national forests in the East?
Zach, you're muted.
Thank you. The real tragedy here is that, well, I was going to say the short answer is no to your question, Len. And the real tragedy here is that even what little old growth we have will be increasingly under threat based on the policy that the Forest Service has proposed. And this is why it is so important for all of you to sign this petition tonight and make sure that your voice is heard, because what we're seeing is actually a potential weakening of the protections that are already in place, at least on the forest where I work, for what little old growth there is. And not only are we not seeing a commitment to expanding old growth, but really creating kind of a blank check for the Forest Service to go in and intervene in these rare old growth stands for any number of different reasons. Around here, those reasons could be, trying to get ahead of an insect or a disease spreading through the landscape. And instead of waiting to see what plays out and allowing these naturally resilient older forests to adapt to these disturbances, very often, you would discover that there are resistant, old growth trees, and you're going to end up doing much more damage by putting roads and skid trails into these places, cutting down trees that really would do much more good, even if they were dead, standing snags or down wood on the forest floor, than they will if they're removed from that old growth and brought to the mill, or worse yet, burned for biomass. So that's the kind of threat that we're really afraid of, and that this policy proposal currently doesn't prevent against, it actually encourages. So that's the story around here right now, sadly. And I really do hope that everyone here will take action tonight and make sure that we push this policy in a different direction.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to ask you, Adam, to answer a similar version of that question. Zach talked about what a good old growth policy could look like in the East, and Jim kind of gave the flavor of the opportunity and the scope and scale that we've got in front of us right now. Maybe contrasting that Eastern view, could you say, like, what kind of necessary protections are required for Western forests, and how could you improve the National Old Growth Amendment draft to make sure that it is effective?
Well, I do appreciate the question and the opportunity to answer that. First we need to look at just what the Old Growth Amendment is doing under the Forest Service's proposed action. And, right off the bat, it fails to protect mature trees or stands so they can develop into future old growth. And, you might have seen me at the beginning toggle some pictures, in my background around. And, what you see behind me is actually in an area called the Great Burn. It burned 3 million acres in 1910 to 1913. And this area here behind me is what would a forest look like if it was allowed to just regenerate and heal from that fire. And right now it's a wilderness quality land. This is an area called Indian Creek in the Great Burn, and it has some amazing old growth trees, large cedars, and just the characteristics and the complexity. So right now, the old growth policy that the Forest Service is proposing in this amendment, it looks at fire as only a threat, and it has to be curtailed, and it has to be curtailed through cutting trees. So right off the bat, we need to address the fact that wildfire isn't just a threat. Certainly can have some harmful effects, but not as harmful as going in with a chainsaw and a bulldozer. And you can just look at the sides of some of the mountains out here, and it's just stacked with lines upon lines of old roads. That is not an intact forest. The other really big flaw that we see in the NOGA is that it fails to acknowledge commercial logging as a primary threat to old growth. So just kind of hammering home that point. And introduces this term called proactive stewardship that lists 12 different criteria for describing when vegetation management would be allowed, including commercial logging. Functionally, this direction does not change how the agency currently manages old growth forests. In fact, it just locks it in place. And essentially the agency is saying, well, hey, we already maintain or promote old growth. Just let us keep doing what we're doing. So it functionally doesn't change the way the agency currently operates. So it fails to retain old growth conditions. In fact, there's a line in the analysis, and I'll just read it, and it says there's no requirement that these areas continue to meet the definition of old growth when managed for the purposes of proactive stewardship. When you read this, you have to understand that we need a different alternative, and an alternative that prohibits the commercial logging of old growth trees, because that commercial incentive is what the agency is trying to meet when it conducts proactive stewardship. In fact, the agency is graded on how much board feet it produces. These things are called timber targets or key performance indicators. When you remove the commercial incentive, it makes the management more honest. And that is what we need to see in an alternative. And just addressing that proactive stewardship again, the agency allows for managing to the minimums. So if the definition says there's 8 trees per acre over 21 inches, when you hug it, diameter at breast height is what it's called, then the agency can manage down to the minimum. It can cut, all the trees there. So if there's 15, it'll cut down to 8 trees. These are the kinds of loopholes that we need to close. And especially out here, you know, in the Northern Rockies, when we see the agency abusing these definitions so egregiously. Happy to answer any follow-ups too.
Thanks, Adam. We had two, I think, well, relatively straightforward questions from the audience that I wanted to answer before we do our last question. So the first, Zach, I'm going to punt to you, but it's pretty simple. What is helicopter logging? And we could add, and why is it bad, if you'd like.
What is helicopter logging? It's the most expensive way to remove timber from the landscape. That's what helicopter logging is. And it makes absolutely no sense to practice just about anywhere, period, much less in West Virginia. So I think that's all I'll say about helicopter logging.
Well, and I think maybe just describing literally what happens might be helpful for.
Well, I mean, well, I actually think Jim is probably better suited to answering that question than I am. But do you want to do that, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, real quickly, what you have is a helicopter, usually very big, powerful helicopters that can hoist a lot of weight. They dangle a cable, they put a noose around the neck of a log, they hoist it into the air, and then they haul it to a concentration area or logging yard, drop it for processing and loading on trucks. So yeah, you have a very expensive equipment, very expensive operator, burns a lot of fuel. It's very high tech, but yeah, largely very expensive. Used generally in areas of high value timber that are steep and difficult to log with other methods.
Thanks. And then Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot for the question that we all love to answer. What qualifies as old growth? And I'll just say, this is a question that can be answered in a lot of different ways, but what do you think is the most useful way for, activists and, your basic Americans to think about this?
Well, I work for the Forest Service, and I guarantee you that no Forest Service employee that works with timber is going to like my answer. But I think for the common person who these national forests belong to, our listeners, these are your national forests, your lands. I would say they're big, old trees. They vary from different parts of the country with different species, but generally, anytime you see a big, old tree that tends to inspire awe, you're probably looking at least a mature tree and more likely an old growth tree. And it's worth repeating. They were virtually eliminated from the eastern United States, and they were largely eliminated from the western United States. So there's very little of what used to dominate the American landscape. There's very little left. It's really the seminal reason why they deserve protection, along with all the things we know now about climate change and ecological services provided by these spectacular old growth forests.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to close us out here. And before I do, I'll just give a little bit of a spiel and an appeal to everybody who's here in the audience, which is the same thing that makes this film compelling, that makes lobbying compelling, that makes personal comments compelling, is about that connection to these places. And so I would just ask that for folks who found some level of impact or personal resonance from this film, or you felt like you saw a character on screen who said something that made you think something or made you feel something, that's the kind of stuff that I think is a really important piece to be including in your comments. And it's absolutely the kind of stuff that is important to be relaying to members of Congress and elected officials, which cues us up very well for what just happened last week. And Alex, this question is for you. But as folks know, you spent the last week bringing your film Crown Jewels, along with some of the filmmakers and a handful of the stars from the film, to Washington, D.C. to talk to decision makers and put on a handful of screenings. Could you describe what the reaction to the film was and what the reaction to the advocacy for old growth, mature forest protections was like?
Yeah, definitely. I was honestly pretty surprised when people had already seen it. Like there were a couple meetings that we went to and people, decision makers or their representatives, like members of their offices were like, I saw the film, it was great. Like, thank you for making it. And that, I think that's a testament to what you just said. Like the reason, I mean, I'm biased, but the reason that I like the film is because it's just a summation of the stories that were so astonishingly touching to us. Like the film wouldn't be resonant if the people that we talked to weren't resonant with us. And I think that that was really well understood on the Hill. So I would encourage you, or encourage everyone here watching us to do what Alex just said, which is continue to hold that heart space in every conversation that you have, because it was evident that it resonated with them too. And it also helps that over the last 2 years, over 750,000 people now have written in to participate in this process. So sharing emotionally resonant experiences is really, really valuable because no one can refute that. And then for people looking to refute it, it's really helpful to back that up with social statistics on top of the science and economic data that we already have that demonstrates how many people really do care about this and how aligned the general public is.
Thanks very much, Alex. And thanks again to everybody who came out tonight.